Anna, I want to start with you and really get your biggest takeaway from this, starting when it comes to wage growth, that 5.6% wage growth. It's still running hot, but not quite as hot as inflation. How should we be looking into this?
Yeah, so I think as you guys suggest, the takeaway from this jobs report is not in the headline disappointment in the non-farm payroll, but in the underlying details. And the underlying details tells me that it's really a really good report. With the wages at 5.6%. Well, you have to consider that not only is wages growing, but the total number of jobs is growing. So even though real wages is below inflation rate, the total labor income in the economy is actually faster than inflation as more people are getting jobs. And then another thing is that the unemployment rate is indeed falling for the right reason, as Scarlett says. Labor force increased by 418K, and most of all, the employment increased by 736K, which is much higher than the non-farm payroll.
Okay, so we can dig into all of that in a little bit, but Emily, I want to bring you in here because most people don't dig in and they just kind of look at the headline numbers. For those in Washington, is this jobs report a victory lap for the Biden White House?
I think the Biden White House is definitely going to count this one as a win for them. They can really tout that low unemployment number. They can make the case that jobs are coming back, that the economy is where it is. And they will really focus on that jobs aspect because they don't really want to focus on inflation right now. That it's not good numbers for the Biden administration, not good numbers for Democrats who are looking at a very difficult midterm coming up here in November. And so we've really seen Democrats stick to job numbers. This data will allow them to really continue that narrative of growth and coming out of it. Although it will be interesting to see if this does factor in at all next week as Congress begins to put together and move funding on COVID-19.
Right. And we know it's something that the White House has been badgering Congress to do, to put it lightly. Anna, you used to work at the White House. You worked at Treasury as well, so you're familiar with the kinds of conversations that take place in the West Wing. What do you think they're saying in the West Wing right now before the president speaks at 10:45 a.m.? How do they frame this?
Yes, they're certainly going to frame it in the positive light. And the positive things in this report is that we see the participation rate as increasing, and usually that comes later in the cycle, but it's coming very fast in this cycle, and it's driven by prime age workers coming back to the job market. So that's a win for the administration. We see, as I mentioned, that they are going to pivot away from the wage increase, the inflation aspect of it, but they will focus on how labor income in the economy is rising, which will support consumption. So what I meant by that is that on one hand, everybody focused on real wages dropping below zero, but on the other hand, you have more people getting jobs. So the income in the household could be rising for people who are finding jobs.
Emily, come on in here and talk a little bit about what we expect to hear from the president. Given what you know about the way that the president uses data in this report, what do you expect him to say at 10:45 this morning when he's expected to speak? What are the numbers in here that he'll highlight?
Well, I think just the employment number, I will say, is going to be a big one. I think the other thing that I'm really expecting from President Biden here is to tie this into the message that we're now hearing from the White House, which is that the pandemic has moved on to a new phase. Enough Americans are vaccinated, enough supplies are out there that even if another wave does come along, most Americans are going to still be able to live a relatively normal life without having to go back into lockdown again. And that's something the White House is really trying to push. Remember, Biden came in as a president who said that he was going to be the one to get the U.S. past the pandemic. There have been some stumbling blocks along the way, as we saw last year with Delta and with Omicron. But Biden's really positioning himself in the run-up to the midterms to make the case to the American people that his administration did do what was needed to move beyond the pandemic. These numbers are certainly going to be used by him to bolster that argument.
You know, I got to go back to inflation because we touched on it, and it's something that most people will think about front and center when they look at this jobs report. Yes, average hourly earnings growth is up 5.6%. That's just one measure of how wages are growing. But inflation, as we mentioned, is up almost 8%. And I know economists don't make these comparisons, these direct comparisons, but ordinary Americans who are paying more for food and fuel certainly do. And so when they hear that this is a strong jobs report, but see that their earnings gains are lagging behind inflation, I wonder, Anna, Typically, historically, when was the last time that wage growth did match inflation, especially in an environment where prices are rising?
Yeah, I mean, that's what you would call a wage price spiral, that if wages tend to lag prices. So it has been a long, long time, Scarlett, when wages are below prices. But yeah, usually it takes a while before you could see wage catching up to prices. And if this if the increase in the prices cause workers to want to bargain for higher of living standards of living adjustment, that could lead to continued wage increase and wage price spiral.
And I want to make sure I understand this. So it is an okay thing and a healthy thing for wages to trail inflation?
It is if the productivity is not catching up. However, if productivity is fast, so let's look at this 5.6% in nominal wages. If productivity is running at 3%, let's say, that is actually a wage of 5.6% would be a good thing, because that would still be consistent with the price stability of 2% inflation in the long run. However, if productivity is less, it means that the businesses are shouldering the cost, and or they're passing along to prices. Either way, it is not good for inflation going forward if productivity is not above 3%.
Right. Now, one area where there's been a lot of productivity, you could argue, is the housing market. There's a big number that I just find fascinating. 156,000, because that is how many people became real estate agents in 2020 and 2021, which is up 60% from the previous 2 years. Clearly, a hot housing market and the flexible work schedule appeal to a lot of people. But Emily, you now have mortgage rates climbing and set to go higher, so we could see a cool down in housing. Overall, has the hot housing market been a positive or a negative for the Biden White House, especially as they get ready for the midterms and people are looking at things like standard of living and affordability?
I mean, there's definitely been concern about housing prices, about rental prices. I mean, I do think there's a valid thing to talk about and discuss how wages are growing compared to how inflation is growing. But I think if you think about your average American, what they are seeing is that their grocery bill is going up, that every time they drive past a gas station, that the numbers are higher than they can ever remember. And I think that those are the things that are really sticking with Americans right now. It's not so much, looking at like, okay, these are my earnings and this is what I'm spending and here's the final number. It's kind of that gut check that you have every time you buy something and realize that it's more expensive than it was. And that's why inflation is something the Biden administration is so concerned about. It is why you see them tapping the strategic petroleum reserves the way they are with those 180 million barrels. And it's why Congress is now trying to start moving legislation that they can wind up making the case is going to either save Americans money in the long run or do some things to address inflation and supply chain bottlenecks.